Welcome to Burning Platforms, our regular look at the politics of technology, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week we look at the upcoming federal election and its implications for tech regulation with Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea, Crikey's tech writer Cam Wilson and Reece Farthing from Reset Australia. It's a great discussion which I hope you enjoy. So welcome to the latest special pre-election edition of Burning Platforms. Lizzie, welcome to the room. Chair of Digital Watch Right, Lizzie O'Shea, her official introduction. Lizzie, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And not one but two first-time platform burners today. Special guest, Cam Wilson from Crikey and the Sizzle. G'day, Cam.
Hello, so good to be here. I feel like I know you guys more than just, we know each other because I listen, I hear, and so now I'm so excited to be here.
That's lovely and creepy at the same time, Cam.
That's what I'm going for.
And Reece Farthing from Reset Australia. G'day, Reece. Thanks for making the time.
Not a problem. Lovely to be here.
So, days out from the federal election, I thought it would be great to have an in-depth discussion on the competing ideas and innovative policies being put forward by candidates in the run-up to polling day. Sadly, that's not possible. Either the major parties have agreed bipartisan on dumb ideas like the children online social media ban, or they've broken up big reforms like privacy, AI regulation and kicked them down the road, or they're just too scared to talk about things in case they draw attention from Trump's tariffs. So this is all a pity because all these areas deserve scrutiny. We have a response to technology, both platform power and AI that is currently really piecemeal. We don't have a minister responsible for the big picture. We have add-ons to a bunch of different ministries, and we have a massively outsized series or an outsized contest between industry self-interest and the public interest. So that's all a bit dispiriting, isn't it? So I thought there might be a useful discussion just to anchor here with people I like to think of the vanguard of digital civil society and a sole media warrior in Cam, just to think through what are the issues we should be leaning into in the next term of government, which is increasingly likely to be a returned Labor government. And also, how do we build the imperative for leaders to respond to these critical issues? And not necessarily as a political bidding war, but as something that is baked into our public discussion. So normally on these things, we try to pretend to have the answer to start off these discussions, but that's really a bunch of questions. Lizzie, how have you felt about this campaign?
Yeah, it's a little bit disappointing because I feel like the tech issues are some of the biggest that are shaping our information ecosystem, the actual experience of the election itself and how we conduct our democracy, but also what are we looking at in terms of the future, our relationship with the United States. The tech industry has obviously been fused with the United States government and they're pushing a particular agenda that affects all different types of regulation when it comes to tech. So it seems it's difficult to be anything except a bit disappointed on that. Having said that, I wouldn't have wanted some knee-jerk response to a problem that we're facing, particularly how we manage a difficult relationship with the United States. So it's perhaps best that some of these responses are more considered and done over time with a new government, if that's what happens. But I'm also just interested to see how much of the unfinished business of the last Labor government will be back on the agenda with gusto, and whether a minority government or a large crossbench will be able to influence some of the key policy areas in that respect. I'm talking about AI regulation, online safety, of course, but also most probably relevant to me, but many listeners, I'm sure, is privacy reform, which felt like it got some treatment, but there's so much left undone there. And we are just continually slipping behind our similar or counterparts in other parts of the world who have much more advanced privacy regimes. And this is such a critical component of how we engage in online life now in multiple different ways. So that reform to me has to be on the agenda, and I would have liked to see a bit more of that discussion in the campaign that hasn't really been there. I would say though, and I'm sure this is where Cam can start to talk about what the reporting he's done, one of the things that has come up in this election is people seem a bit surprised at how much is possible when it comes to political parties profiling people. I did a radio grab the other day where a radio producer was shocked at how much people's personal information was known to political parties and why was this allowed. And I had to educate them that political parties have an exemption from the Privacy Act that allows them to do all sorts of data profiling that, almost no one else with that kind of level of reach is capable of doing in society. And I think that is an interesting gap between people's understanding and the of what is protected by privacy law, but also what they would consider to be a social license to do that kind of work. And I think most people do not like political parties holding that kind of personal information. I don't know if you feel the same about that, Cam.
Yeah, it's almost like the Trumpet of Patriots is a campaigning wing of privacy reform to show the problems that we need to be addressing. But you've done some great reporting and love to know a bit more about what you've learnt on the journey. I would say also on exemptions, though, that it's not just political parties, which seems to be the exemption that's hardest to knock over. It's media companies, it's small business, and there's a couple of other ones in there as well, aren't there, Lizzie? So
there are. I mean, the reporting one is a bit more sophisticated, but yeah, small business, of course, is a big problem, and for a variety of different reasons we can go into. But yeah, look, there's also, if information is de-identified, that falls outside of the Privacy Act. We could go on about this forever, the gaping holes in our Privacy Act that need to be reformed. But I think it's much more interesting to hear from Cam about some of his reporting.
Go, Cam.
No, it's interesting. And you mentioned actually the media companies and the amount of data they have on people and how they handle it. I think a really uncovered story in Australian media and privacy is just the fact that Australia's biggest media companies have enormous ad targeting operations, similar in ways to the big tech. But we don't really hear that much about that. We get kind of conspiratorial. I guess it's not really conspiratorial to say that, the people who are in charge of dictating the major news aren't super excited to dissect that, but we'll put that to the side. But yeah, I mean, I think elections is such an interesting time to look and think about all this privacy stuff because, it kind of, in the same way that it focuses my work and, I'm reporting on it, it also focuses what everyone is paying attention to. And when they get, the spam texts from, I think it's Harry Fong this time for the Trumpet of Patriots, Clive Palmer's party, or whether it's Monique Ryan or any of the parties, the kind of fake postal vote letters that they send out to everyone, it's on the front of our minds. We're getting bombarded with this stuff, and it reminds us just, how far companies and political parties can kind of go with, even without the exemptions, but particularly with the exemptions, to do things that a lot of us feel pretty icky about. So, I mentioned those fake postal vote contacts before. So that's it used to be and still includes political parties send out letters that kind of seem like they are non-partisan, like they're from the AEC, for example, saying you can sign up for a postal vote, and they send you a letter and you can send it back to them. And now they have websites that kind of do the very same thing, except that doesn't go directly to the AEC to get a postal vote. It goes to them, who they take your details and then they pass it on to the AEC, hopefully. That's an example of stuff that people were quite outraged about. The spam text as well, under the Privacy Act, we're supposed to have kind of the ability to say, can you please stop texting me? If you get a text from someone, it's supposed to give you a way to opt out. You can't really do that with political parties. Something that actually at Crikey we took advantage of, because this election we've been running a candidate to find out all the various privileges and rights that political candidates can get and use them ourselves to kind of make a point of it. So we just published a piece about how we've been texting back Harry and Monique with our own spam texts. And unfortunately for them, because we're a political candidate, they can't opt out of that either, to give them a taste of their own medicine. So that there's a whole bunch of ways that they are, reaching out to people that involves, obviously ideas about how people are allowed to contact people, and also like what we know about them. And a little story that I had 2 weeks ago was about how the Victorian Liberals accidentally kind of left part of their newsletter provider exposed that allowed us to see what kind of information and how they were categorizing voters. And so for their voters, they were splitting them up into things like whether they were a strong Liberal voter, whether they were predicted Chinese or predicted Jewish, all these ways that they were thinking about how to segment the electorate to kind of contact them. So yeah, I mean, like, there's a whole bunch of stuff we could talk about forever. I don't want to dominate conversation, but I do actually like these times as much as it does grate me that, some people get special treatments because, of course, political parties are going to give themselves an easy go. But it does, I think, actually really bring up some of these issues that are important to people that don't just stop once the election stops. People still are frustrated, angry about them. And I hope that kind of we can use that energy to be like, let's talk seriously about how we continue to reform Australia's privacy laws.
Yeah. The political parties say that they are a special case because they have a responsibility to communicate with electors so they're well informed for elections, so they need to have more information. I think that's in theory what they're saying. And I think there's probably an area where business as usual is very targeted information about voters. And then there's also the dirty tricks and the bad stuff that's going on, some of the stuff that you've exposed. I don't know where that line is and whether there should be a line there. I'd like them to define what the public interest is a little bit more, though, because I think at the moment the free-for-all just isn't working.
It's so dangerous, though. The idea that they're collecting a list of people who they classify as predicted Jewish, and they are not subject to kind of if there's a mass data breach, they may not have to tell anybody that this occurred. This is a bit of a problem. That's quite sensitive information, even if it's information they've inferred themselves. I just don't think it's something we can always trust upon where the safety issues become elevated. So I think it's worth a rethink, of course, and there's a huge public support for it. But I think it's like asking them to vote against a pay rise. Like, it's not going to happen, right? But
it's pretty bloody hard.
Exposing these scandals is quite important, I think, to kind of shaping the debate on it, though.
And there is one thing I was thinking about, which I wrote a short piece, kind of analysis piece on. So Meta, which owns like Facebook and Instagram, they, it's well known that they have a hugely sophisticated ad targeting mechanism that businesses can use, but obviously political parties can use. And one of the main ways that they allow advertisers to target users is you can put in whatever data you want. They'll match it to the Facebook users. So say I've got a bunch of email addresses. You say, Meta, here's all these email addresses. Can you find all the people, if they're on there, who have Meta accounts, so I can target them with messages. And I found that about close to 20% of all of Australia's political advertising was through this kind of method in the election so far. Why does this matter? Well, because that's completely opaque. We have no idea what actual information they're putting in there, how they are targeting them. And like, it may be something as kind of, and I know that in many cases it's something as like not inane, but like kind of like normal. And I would feel pretty comfortable with the idea that, like, for example, they upload an email list to people who they know have emailed MPs to be on an issue, to be like, we'll contact them about that issue. I think that's people feel pretty reasonable about that. You care about something, probably good to get targeted advertising on it. But for example, we know all the other ways that technology allows people to segment audiences. There was this Microsoft ad targeting leak a couple of years ago that Reset, actually, this is my chance to kind of pass the baton, did some analysis on. And what they found was all these different ways that Australian people were targeted and broken down to segments. And that included things like people who they decided were interested in discount rates on alcohol. So you could kind of see it as a proxy for people who maybe drink a lot or maybe too much. They had target segments for people who were viewed as at high financial risk. Like there are very, with all the information we have in the world, all the different ways to kind of break them down, all the sources of information that political parties could buy, because it's not just the information that they get themselves, but they can get it from third parties and do whatever with. They could be using that to then target voters with specific messages. And like to me, like that kind of targeting feels a bit uncomfortable but we have no transparency into something like that.
Yeah, but there's very little boundaries about the way that that tech works. So thinking, this is more broad than just elections. But alongside the piece that Cam was talking about, where we looked at, well, what are the actual data segments that are available about Australian audiences, and not just to political parties. These are data segments available to anyone who buys access to the real-time bidding service without any boundaries. We actually looked at what are some of the categories that Meta and Google use to allow advertisers, so any advertiser, to use that lookalike audience feature that Cam mentioned. So here are people, you upload your audience segment based on ABC, and you're like, go and find me people who look like this. But you can also construct your audience lookalikes. And some really risky things like, we did, because it's really obviously just categorically wrong. We did, here are some pro-eating disorder pages and accounts. Can you go and find me lookalike audiences of people who engage with this page? Or Google, can you go and find me people who've downloaded these eating disorder or mental health management apps and have used them in the last 24 hours? And can we construct an audience based on that? Like, the limits to the types of audience you construct with this ad tech is pretty risky and absolutely and completely opaque. We just don't know.
And also really shitty politics, because it turns politics just into a micro targeting a different message for every individual, which is not how you build. My theory is that it creates some more reactionary right-wing politics, because you build movements through connections. If there is anything interesting that I find slightly hopeful in this election, has been the use of podcasters and influencers to talk to leaders, which is without a cash transaction changing hands, which to me seems like a more unifying way of communicating with an audience in a public way. Whereas you're right, these targeted under the bonnet, I just can't see how that leads to a more informed electorate, or one that is going to build the consensus that we're meant to be building in democracy, right?
As someone who sits across, I do research in Australia and also internationally, the thing that sort of catches me around this is that internationally, the ad libraries that platforms run, that they have to keep, that they have to preserve, that at least is meant to give you an insight into how micro-targeted are these audiences, and actually what is the information that, Group A is receiving compared to Group B. So at least, even if we can't do something about the fact that there is no shared fact, we at least understand what these different groups are being exposed to. Those ad libraries just aren't as rigorous and don't really work in Australia. They aren't required to provide the same level of information. They aren't required to be as accurate. They're just voluntary in Australia, right? So we've got these platforms who are basically choosing what they'll tell us about who receives these micro-targeted ads, and it's their choice. And when there's a mistake, there's no recompense to it. And you just sort of think that's the environment where really bad stuff can happen.
Yeah, I was like, when I wrote that piece about how much is on this, kind of opaque form of targeted advertising through Meta, I did actually read a 2022, I think, report from the Civil group in Europe that was talking about the EU elections. And they were saying, actually, hey, maybe we shouldn't allow targeted political advertising like this. Not so much for the reason that Peter said, because I think that's a slightly different, like, movement-based kind of argument, but this idea that, like, what does it do to society if you can target people in such a micro way with messages that could, and sometimes even be contradictory to each other, and like Reece said, is very opaque. Like, this kind of creates the opportunity for like tricky games being played by political parties. And at the very least, even if that doesn't happen, the fact that they can do that certainly isn't making people, feel more positive and united about, the whole political system.
And politics being war without bullets, if it can be done, it probably will be done. If not this cycle, at some cycle too. Look, we'll push on a little bit with the discussion, but that's been fantastic, guys. So if the election is a case study in the need for privacy law reform, Lizzie, it might also be a case study in the need to reconsider what online harms means. There's new research, I think, out of the States, is it, showing that getting off social media during elections is a shortcut to happiness. What's going on there?
Yeah, it's from the National Bureau of Economic Research. This follows on from a project researching actually the 2020 election. So it was mapping the effects, and they were following about 20,000 users who deactivated either from Facebook or Instagram, and they compared it with a control, but also people who deactivated for a full 6 weeks before the election and a single week, and were paid to do it. But it basically results in an improvement in your happiness. I mean, well-being, I suppose, is what I would describe it as. But it's interesting because they
also give you happiness a score, don't they, to the decimal point? I want to know how that works.
Yeah, well, when you read some of the questions, you're like, oh, okay. So, but like, of course, when you research these things, they're going to have to be done in a particular way. But yeah, I think what it signals is that there's probably grounds for doing more research of this kind. But it suggests some interesting things as well, like that the time that's freed up when you go off Facebook is actually not necessarily substituted with the use of other apps, but the time with Instagram is substituted to other smartphone apps. So you don't necessarily get back the time. You might end up using it in other places, but there's probably a difference in how those apps impact on your daily life and happiness in different ways as well. So this is the largest study that I think I could find, or I think that's what they say in the study. There's some other ones, but the largest of its kind, and it does suggest, I think, an interesting vein of potential trends that we can continue to research. Because the other thing it does suggest is that it may not actually be to do with the election. I mean, I was looking at the paper and it described a very low percentage of content shared on those platforms that related to the election, which I sort of wondered about that because I'm not sure how you necessarily classify what is election related and what isn't. But they were obviously doing it around the 2020 election, but that may be a factor that influenced people because it's obviously a period of heightened political stress, I suppose. They talk about.
It was a pretty dark time, 2020.
Yeah.
To be fair.
To be fair, but it's possible that this is able to be generalised. Is the upshot of what they were arguing in this paper in terms of analysing these results. But I guess this comes as probably a surprise to absolutely no one who uses these apps, to be honest. And certainly the research that we know from whistleblowers that came out of places like Meta for Instagram suggests that's true for certain demographics. There is some suggestion of differences by gender as well and by age and the like. So all this stuff highlights to me the frustration in some respects because we know these companies know this stuff about how their users experience the platforms, but we're required to kind of verify it through independent research in order to make a claim from a policy perspective that things ought to be done differently or that that companies might have to work harder to earn their social license to operate, whatever it may be. But I think that was an interesting study. The other study I'll just put out there before I open it up to larger minds than mine is about AI. So I thought these two could kind of go together. There is some research now about the impacts of using AI on critical thinking skills and possibly, again, not as a surprise to people, but the effect of using AI tools is to usually engage in some form of what's called cognitive offloading. So you give the task to the AI and that supposedly frees you up to think about other things. But in reality, it looks like there's a significant impact on your capacity to do critical thinking and reasoning and things like deep thinking. And again, there's a social dynamic here. What does your time freed up to do? And it may not be to do that kind of deep thinking that is, expands your brain. And it might be so that you can do other things.
You get unhappy on social media.
Yeah, you spend your time on other apps. There's a distinction, I think, that's interesting by gender. By age specifically. People who are older, who have higher levels of education as well, tend to do better at preserving their critical thinking capabilities, whereas younger people tend to do worse. But some of the more interesting stuff that came out of this paper, which I think is worth noting, is in some of the qualitative interviews they did, there's some really interesting quotes from people who talk about how particularly young, there was a quote from a young person which talks about how they don't know that they would know how to problem solve without the use of AI. And as someone else said, I sometimes wonder if AI is subtly nudging me towards decisions I wouldn't normally make. And I do think that's an interesting observation. Like Emily Bender talks about using AI as a kind of tool when you're looking through a car window and it's raining, the rain obscures what's behind in the scene behind. And you can see how the way in which the rain might fall on the window pane does shape how you understand or you interpret the data that you see beyond the window. And I think that shaping mechanism is something that we don't often think about, that the way in which these AIs whatever the application might be, churn up information and turn it into a set of responses does shape how you yourself start to respond to data too. It's a subtle form of organizing. So anyway, I think these studies are interesting because we have to learn to interrogate how our information ecosystem works in circumstances where a lot of the tools that we're being given don't push us towards developing our critical thinking faculties. And I don't think it's just like a social panic of making us all dumb, but I think it is worth thinking about what kind of education in particular we need, or curriculum, what kind of approach to education in particular we need to develop that gives people the best footing for entering a world in which they'll have to interact with machines in a lot of their daily life over future generations. So big implications, I think, for AI use in education.
Reese, social media making us sadder, AI making us dumber. That's my headline out of this. But where do you take that?
From a research perspective or a policy perspective?
Oh, from a Reese perspective.
Yeah, look, it's interesting. I mean, I think, I've been following a lot of the research that's looking at well-being, the well-being impacts from being connected, and particularly from social media. And it's an incredibly complex terrain of study in general. So, there's a whole bunch of studies early on, old studies that tried to correlate screen time to well-being, particularly with children and young people. And of course, lo and behold, the results were mixed, because the question is not, how long are you on a screen? It's sort of, what are you actually doing online? Which, Lizzie, I think you pointed to with that, okay, well, what are you replacing Instagram with versus Facebook? There's all sorts of questions. And I don't think it's been sort of categorically answered yet, because these are, incredibly difficult things to research around. Like, how do you create a double-blind study where, if we're looking at young people's well-being, because that's a hot topic, where some young people access the digital world and social media and some young people don't, right? Our sort of research methods go a little bit out the window when it comes to this. And I think, I'm always mindful that I don't envy policymakers in this environment where they're being really kind of hammered in a hot political environment to make decisions. And that sort of evidence is lacking. And so I just think it's really tough. And I think for young people in particular, we need to be really mindful and cautious of what we're taking as evidence, partly because there's low quality, there's a lot of it. But then on the other side, there's real risks, right? Like, if we hang around waiting forever for the perfect double-blind scientific study, young people grow up and live whole childhoods while we're waiting for perfect evidence. It's a really sort of complex area.
And without the evidence and the thinking through of the studies, you end up with something like the political intervention in a show trial to ban social media, although it doesn't look like it's actually being banned. You've been very articulate in your disdain for this particular policy, Cam. Do you want to sort of hit it from a couple of meters out?
Sure, thanks for teeing me up. And I appreciate how thoughtful Reese was, and then by being, taking kind of both sides of it comfortably, and I'm just going to go have a swing at it. No, I actually, so I've reported on the teen social media ban pretty closely for the last 6 months or so. And I think it's hard to, let me start and be generous. It's very hard to do policy in such a complex space where we just don't really understand the evidence, I think, totally. And I think the people who I end up having the biggest issue is the people who say the evidence is clear one way or the other, when I don't think it is. I also think that while, and also the fact that it's such a heated debate, we talk about all this stuff on this podcast, but particularly when it comes to children, the most sensitive and sacred of all topics and society's resources, I guess you'd say, emotions are high. So I get it. The teen social media ban, the kind of increasingly critical approach they've had to it is that I think that this policy that Australia has passed, that is bipartisan, that has been kind of celebrated to the rest of the world, is a really shitty piece of policy. I think it's constructed in a way that whether you're someone who is like, I think that there are all these problems and the solution is to ban teens from social media, or if you're someone who is like, I don't think that's the solution, either way, you should probably be unhappy with this policy, because while obviously it's pretty obvious why someone who doesn't support this would not be happy with it, but the people who want to see, something drastic done about things like, fearing about children's mental health, fearing about radicalization, fearing about all these issues that have kind of been uncomfortably just like put together as the one like problem and now solved with this very broad topic. The way that the government's actually come about this policy, which in effect is not like a broad social media ban, it's a ban on teens having social media accounts on a few platforms, but not including YouTube and YouTube Shorts, that they're implementing at the end of the year with some like real, and with the details about how they're actually going to enforce it and all the implications of, of the difficulty in proving what someone's age is online yet to be figured out. It's something that like, I think this is kind of where I come down on it, and why I've been so kind of passionate about it is because I'm like, if we need to do something for our children. It's such an important issue, and we've decided that that's important enough to do something so quickly. And then when we kind of get down to it and realize, actually, it's quite difficult to do this policy. Why are we rushing through this broad policy that is on something that is so important? The same kind of energy that has been motivating people to really care about this should also be the energy that makes people realize maybe we should actually take the time to get it right. But the way that the parties have done it, and I should note that it is a broadly very popular policy. A lot of people are worried about what's happening to their children generally, and particularly with their use of the internet. They've just decided to kind of wave it through. And that's kind of why I've been disappointed this week, because I'm like, out of all the things that you guys fight about, which is a lot, the thing that you've agreed upon is actually something I would love to see some substantial debate on. And there just hasn't been that.
It's also really unusual from a comparative perspective. Because one of the things that I saw is, all of this hoo-ha about Australia being the first place in the world to do this and like really leading the way. And I'm just sort of scratching my head. So I'm like, that there are like literally like loads of countries in Europe where the minimum age to access social media and particular things is 16, right? Like that's the kind of default in GDPR, unless countries have said something different. And so there's actually like loads of evidence and loads of different experiences that could be learnt from different countries where 16 is the minimum age, both around like how does that work in practice, how is it enforced, but also are there the impacts on well-being that everyone can, as you rightly pointed out. Every single person in Australia wants those well-being benefits for our young people, right? Like that's what we really agree on, and that's what we're passionate about. We could have a look and see what the impacts are and see what actually works. But we don't seem to be. We just seem to be sort of like running for this thing where we're like, E-Safety Commission, you sort it out, go. And that's,
go and have another fight with big tech on our behalf.
That's where we've landed.
And look, I get it in a way. Like when I first came into thinking about the digital rights and I had teenage kids, it was ban it. It's evil. Stop it now. And it takes a bit of unpacking a few layers to think through the complexity of what that looks like and what that means. And I know Lizzie's probably laughed from the sidelines as I've gone on that journey and kind of become a bit more lesser regulate hard and more let's look at the rights as the framework for doing it. But it just watching it, it was almost like watching a kindergarten debate about a complex policy over that period, particularly those bizarre summits they put on where and I know you guys were quite active, Reece, in harnessing some academic voices of reason, but it was just a full pile-on and there was not much space for debate, was there?
No.
Lizzie?
I would just say there's one, sorry. Well, I would just say also, you've come to this different view, Peter, in your time, but I've also had a child in this time. But I do, like I must say,
ban it.
No. That's not where I landed. But what I would say is my capacity to manage my child's use of devices is basically referable to the fact that I have a supportive partner. I have a job with good work-life balance. We live a very high-quality life in a major city. I don't work shifts. All these kinds of things that I can completely understand how people end up using devices with their kids, because it serves a bunch of different purposes very well that reflect broader social problems that we have, and we don't support parents through, and also as soon as I send him to school, he's going to have an experience of using screens all the time. So I just would say it's not that I have a different view, but I completely understand how this social context evolves, where, both people are anxious about putting their kids in front of devices, but also end up doing it. And I don't hold any parents responsible who do for the ill effects. And I think working out who should be holding responsibility for it and how we regulate is an imperative task that we need to do better on, for the reasons that Cam gave. I just wanted to add one more thing, which is I did read a really interesting article in Science recently that kind of backed what you were saying before, Reese, that talked about the particular challenges with social researchers gathering enough data and insights to be able to inform proper policy making in circumstances where the tech moves very fast. And the research can take a long time to form definitive conclusions from. And these researchers kind of propose a different model of more rapid turnaround research that is more iterative, also that complements a similar approach to policy making, which I can sort of understand. Like, we just don't have the luxury of a longer term vision in this space, but we do have to find ways to avoid making mistakes. So I might get Peter to put that on the episode's website, that article.
I will do that, but that also feels like a really good segue into the work that Reese and Reset have been doing on the Children's Privacy Code, because from the cheap seats, it looks like an attempt to at least do consultation with a bit more granular engagement, not just with advocates, but also with kids, which is, I don't know if it's the first for Australia, but I haven't seen it anywhere else. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the project and what you've been learning along the way, Reese?
Yeah, sure. And look, thank you for that generous intro. I assure you there have been loads of consultations with children and young people elsewhere in the world as well, including around kind of privacy codes and design codes as well. But certainly, look, what we've been trying to do is, ever since the legislation passed that, as Lizzie mentioned, that sort of piecemeal piece around privacy passed in, what was it? Was it September or October last year? Late
December.
There we go. God, time flies. And the Children's Privacy Code was in that. And we were actually, as an organisation at Reset Tech, but also I think a lot of the children's rights organisations that I work with were deeply excited about that. I know that it wasn't the big overarching privacy, bullseye that we were all hoping for. But it was a little piece, right? It was a little piece that offered some glimmer of hope for children and young people who I think are deeply affected by the datafication of the digital world. And we started thinking about, okay, well, if this is going to be the best code that it possibly can be, what could civil society do to help develop that, right? Like, there's a role for civil society in advocacy and calling for legislations, regulations, all those sorts of things. Once you've actually got them, what can you do? And so we started thinking meaningfully about where our strengths were. And it was a little bit of thinking around, okay, well, there's expertise in civil society, right? So one of it is that we can offer up our expertise around, some of the particular challenges, Lizzie, that you mentioned. There's no complete evidence around this stuff, but actually in all of the research we've done, there's a pocket of knowledge here, there's an insight here. What can we do to sort of try and pull that together in the drafting phase as the code is being drafted by the privacy regulator? But also, children and young people have incredible knowledge about their own lives, what will work, what won't work, what are their key priorities. And we have been working with children and young people right the way through the advocacy for this code. So we just thought we'd sort of ramp it up a little bit and do some work with children and young people, where we actually connected children and young people directly with the Privacy Commissioner and her team on a couple of points, and ran some polling, ran some more consultation, and asked questions that were quite specifically about the privacy code, what its focus should be, micro nuances of what young people think the difference between direct marketing and targeted advertising might be. Not in that language, because that would be a lot for a 14-year-old to grapple with, but in understanding this piece and actually sort of gathering that up and giving it to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioners. teams so they've got it as they're drafting the code. And I think that is, it's something that we did sort of strategically to try and create evidence.
What's the top line of what you've found? Because, the stereotype is that kids don't care about privacy, everything's out there already. So, forget it.
I think that's a sort of misreading, or the first level reading patterns. Australians, young people, but also all of us, have a deeply complicated relationship with privacy. So firstly, it's not particularly understood or experienced as a right. And so that's normalized. Like, I can remember, I lived in London for years, and I can remember being truly shocked and sending this astonishingly long and vocal email to my bank when I came home and started an Australian bank account, because after starting a bank account, they sent me a week later an email message that I considered to be an ad. And I was like, this is not why you have my email address. Right. We've kind of, and people were sort of shocked I did that. There's this normalization of this, right? And that includes young people. We're not used to it. But then when you ask, okay, but do you want it? Young people are like, oh my God, yeah, actually, like, here's 100 things I'd like done better to improve my privacy. And if we can have rules that mean ABC, this is absolutely what we want, right? So I think this idea that young people don't understand privacy, or that they don't value it, is a conflation or a misreading of the fact that actually we should be deeply disappointed that we've let young people down to the point where they don't expect it, right? Like, when a young person says, but what are you going to do? They're going to take your data. I don't think that's a young person saying, and I'm okay with that. I think that's a young person sort of saying, shame on you for letting that be the case.
Yeah, so Reece, it's funny, like, thinking about the children's code in relation to the teen social media ban. We were talking about, well, like, we wish we had some, election debate over these issues, but actually, like, the area where we do see, the policies where we do see tech policy elevated to a national level, I feel like we don't often end up with like very nuanced policy, whereas like something like this, we're hoping to see, and based on the consultations, it seems like we're seeing a more steady approach to kind of this regulation. I guess my question is, like, given the fact that, like, this code, when it's passed and implemented, I think at the end of next year, by then, the teen social media ban will be in place as well. So while that's not all of what the code will encompass, children's, all of their online, activity, and not just like social media. Do you think to some extent that, like, this on one hand, we've got this big kind of sledgehammer policy that's then making the kind of more steady, detailed regulation done at, not at the hype level, that this, like, the sledgehammer is then making it actually harder to kind of get those good incomes from nuanced policy?
Yeah, look, and I absolutely agree with you. I think to a certain extent, this is absolutely to be expected. So I'm incredibly nervous about any big policies coming through at the moment. So I know Lizzie and Peter, at the start of this session, you were like, it's disappointing that we haven't seen any big policy debates. But actually, like, I'm a deeply nervous person in general. I worry about everything. And in this context, I just worry that the climate for digital policymaking is so hot that the path to calm, rational decision-making is tough, right? And so, Cam, you're absolutely right. Like, where policymaking becomes politicized, like the social media ban, and in that climate, you see, like, we've got foreign governments throwing their weight around, industry literally calling for the Australian economy to be harmed if we regulate, and an incredibly polarized Australian community that's capable of generating, what was it, like 15,000 submissions in one day to a discussion about a policy. It's really hard to make nuanced policy. That's where you start to get the sledgehammers, right? The sledgehammers come out. And so I think it's no surprise that actually the rational debate is happening in the spaces where the sledgehammers haven't emerged. That's sort of always going to be the case. But I think that it doesn't limit the fact that we've got a sledgehammer happening in one place, or an emergency handbrake, depending what metaphor you want to pull. I'm not 100% sure will completely nullify the impact of the Children's Privacy Code, right? Like, firstly, the code extends right up until 18. The ban extends at 16. Secondly, it covers a really broad range of sectors that the social media ban doesn't, including, really important things like, the Privacy Commissioner has the ability to designate things like EdTech or wearable health tech or other sorts of things that are just collating particularly sensitive data about young people. And I think where I still hold hope for the Children's Privacy Code, or still hold hope, where I hold a lot of hope and I'm deeply optimistic, beyond my nervous personality, is the fact that actually this is a systemic piece of regulation, right? Like, this is about trying to look at the way data is collected, used, shared, sold. It's about the way the machine works rather than the way a user works or who a user is or what a user does, right? And I think that the impact of that in the Australian regulatory framework is both, a phenomenal modelling tool, right? Like, we can now look at this and see, okay, well, maybe this is how we do it, right? Like, there's one piece around this. This is enforceable. The only place where in Australian regulation we've got that systemic approach elsewhere is in the Online Safety Act, in that small thing called the Basic Online Safety Expectations, which aren't enforceable. And the only powers regulators have around that really are to ask questions, not to sort of demand change, right? So this is about doing that sort of systemic piece really well. But also, if we can do that and we can drive the changes in the system, then perhaps we don't need those sorts of emergency handbrakes like social media bans or other things going forward. I'm not saying we're ever going to see the social media ban overturned because, the Children's Privacy Code has fixed social media. But actually, we might not see things get so bad that there is just that incredibly hot public environment where we need to run into an election with a policy promise.
Yeah, I think there's real promise here as well, because it removes the capacity for politics to interfere in a negative way, but it's not necessarily being approached as an anti-democratic kind of form of regulation that's just done behind closed doors between, say, industry and a regulator or whatever it may be. Like, I think it's important, I think, to preserve some democratic accountability over how rulemaking happens. But I also think there's some real utility in thinking about rulemaking that doesn't just require politicians who are elected on a semi-regular basis to be the people who drive and draft it, and then also have to put their political capital behind it. But I did want to ask you a bit, Reece. Obviously, you talked at the start about different places around the world implementing different things. The one I wanted to ask you about is the UK equivalent, which is it was talked about by the attorney in this particular proposal, and I think it's looked to as being the model, but there is also criticism of that, particularly its application. Do you think there's any key takeaways from that we would benefit from in our own drafting process?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this sort of the UK's age appropriate design code is going to look incredibly different to the Australian Children's Online Privacy Code, right? Like, we've talked about them previously in the same breath as if they will be the same thing. It is very clear that the Australian one now arises completely from the existing Australian Privacy Act. So I think we're sort of comparing apples and pears in one instance. Wait, apples and oranges, isn't it? Apples and pears are actually quite close. Apples and oranges in that sense.
But things go pear-shaped.
But things do go pear-shaped.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things we can learn from the UK code is, and I don't know whether I take full responsibility. I can't possibly do that. I want full transparency and full disclosure here. I was working with the Five Rights Foundation when the Age Appropriate Design Code was passed. So we did a lot of work around sort of that process as well. And I think that what we saw in the UK subsequent to that was that the difficulties of implementation emerge as with any piece of regulation. And I think there's a real role for early complaints and early testing of legislation to make sure that it's meaningful, because I think that one of the things that can happen with any law, any regulation, and we've got a lot of them, is you've got this great legislation on paper, but it doesn't mean anything and it doesn't do anything. And when you let things sit for too long, I think that's when it becomes the norm that the legislation is there, but nothing happens. And one of the experiences that I take, not just from the UK, but from other countries that have implemented codes and similar sorts of codes around children's data use, is that you've got to make it have teeth, and you've got to make it have teeth early on. Otherwise, that culture of normalization, the culture of violation being the normal process, I think just sets in.
I know it's not a binary, but when you look at this challenge, do you look at what you want the end point to be, which I assume is protecting children's rights, or do you look at the little steps and the gates that you go through, the decisions that are in front of you, in the small picture rather than the long-term big picture, and how do you reconcile those two?
Me as a
the work you're doing with the children's policy, right?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you need both. And sorry, Cam accused me earlier of having a very diplomatic.
That's not necessarily
I don't know.
It takes all sorts.
You're not a loose unit, Reece. That's not always a bad thing.
Let it rip.
I'll let my diplomacy rip. All right, I'll go here. This is the most unbelievably banal answer, but you need both, right? Like, you need to know what it is that you're driving for, and what is the end state you want, both for, the outcome for children and young people, but also the policy that leads to that outcome. And I think, maybe this is a controversial part. I think in Australia, there's a real lack of there's not enough time given in civil society to thinking through those links. Like, what's the end state you want for young people, whoever your group that you advocate for is, and then what's the policy that will get you there? So there's a lot of slippage there. I think we can firm that up. But then once you know what the policy is that you want, you just have to look at what's happening minute by minute. What are the options in front of you? What's the way that the public opinion is going? What's the way policy is going? And then just react and respond, keeping in mind where you want to go and what you want to achieve. And I think that one of the things that we've been very lucky at Reset is that, we've seen a lot of legislation that has options. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, and we're sort of optimists enough. I say that's hilarious. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a deep pessimist as a human being. But as
you're deeply nervous and pessimistic.
Yeah. I mean, look.
This is not a counselling podcast, but please keep sharing.
I think you can engage with a lot of policy discussions and a lot of policy debate about what seems to be some pretty meh or pretty bad policy. And actually, there's a lot of opportunities to improve.
I must say, I'm glad that time is being taken in respect of this. But the other thing I sort of wonder about this sometimes is, when we talk about like the ban of young people on social media or a children's online privacy code, I think they're so valid. But I also think sort of there are other segments of society that are particularly vulnerable that we sometimes just forget about. And one of the things that was pretty disappointing to me about the social media ban was the idea that you just toss then children on young people onto social media at a time at which you've deemed them to be responsible for their actions, and then
because then it will be great,
and we don't address the underlying problems of that whole space and what are the business motivations that cause it to be the way it is. It absolves politicians of the responsibility to do that work, which is arguably more difficult, or it involves facing off against more significant interests that would have a benefit for everyone. And it's not just, I'm really pleased that children get special treatment because we owe them that obligation. And I don't want us to mess up policy making in relation to this issue. But I do want to see some of that process then translated into more general policy making if we can. And that's what I sort of hope comes out of this process too. I don't know how much you think that is possible, Reece.
Look, I mean, firstly, I agree. The social media ban sets a really strange precedent, right? Where if there's a problem between a particular type of technology and a particular cohort, just kick them off. I'm like, as a woman who uses social media apps and feels unsafe all the time, like,
you're part of the problem.
My mother who gets scammed online. I'm like,
exactly.
People off.
Over 70s is at risk. They need to be booted off. I mean, I don't even mean that glibly. I genuinely worry about them.
Dudes with gaming addictions, get them off.
Yeah, exactly. But look, I appreciate that awesome question. I think that I keep coming back to that normalisation of the really egregious ways that Australian people's data is being used, right? Like, it is shocking to me as someone who lived overseas for so long, the daily microaggressions almost of data use and stuff that I see. Like, I've spoken about this before, but here's another sort of personal therapy session for you, Peter. When I signed up to my Australian GP, you have to download an app to book an appointment. I think that's quite common. That app is a commercial product that then started sending me ads for weight loss products because I'm a woman of a certain age. And I'm like, this is technically coming from my doctor at this point. Is my doctor telling me I'm medically overweight or not? Right? Like, it is just everywhere in Australia. It's egregious. And the hope that I have is that if we can get it right for children and young people, potentially we can puncture that normalization. Or Lizzie, you talked earlier about the windscreen being like blurry with rain. Like, maybe if we can make one clear spot, you can kind of see like, oh, a window can be clear, right? Like, if we can get this right for children and young people, it opens up the policy imagination to get it right. Maybe for other cohorts, maybe it's like old people next, these people next, or maybe it's everyone next, right? But I think that we've got a really clear and good shot for getting it right for children and young people that might be a good precedent. I don't know.
And we will have to send a copy of this recording to Dan Stinton, who's currently riding around Japan on a motorcycle, to give him some ideas in his new role as Health Engine CEO. Just rounding out the discussion, Reece. So, from where you are now, what for this part of the project, what does success look like, and what are you looking at doing in the event that, which I think is becoming increasingly likely, as we said at the beginning, that the government's return for another term?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're committed to the Children's Privacy Code. We'll see this process through for as long as we can continue to be helpful for the code drafters. So, that's really, Lizzie, you mentioned before about, it being about where regulation is written by regulators rather than industry or, legislators behind closed doors. There are these opportunities for discussion. We will keep engaging and keep trying to maximise sort of public, I don't know whether you say discussion, debate, engagement, rational evidence in that space for as long as we can. After the election, we don't know. I think it's going to depend on what who's in power and also what they're calling for. But again, I think, I'm aware and I note that it's an incredibly hot political climate, and the risks for any even what might seem like rational policy proposals to be put forward and continue and be implemented in a reasonable manner. Difficult times, right? I think can I just say the one thing that I think has got to be made painfully obvious that I think we can absolutely see now is this engagement with industry in the policymaking process that previously Australia has really relied on, in this like good faith multi-stakeholderism that we sort of, have held dear. I'm not convinced that's ever been a great idea, but I mean, surely after this election, we've got to see that it absolutely can't be, right? Like, it's completely wedged Australian policymaking and made it a little bit helpless, right? Like, on the one hand, we've got this situation where our domestic lawmakers are being weakened because their ability to do anything on tech is used as a negotiating point in tariff wars. But on the other hand, if they are brave and stand up to, tech and push ahead with any of their regulations, what happens is they become hopelessly reliant on these exact same companies and these exact same their representatives, I should say, as code drafters and code regulators to actually describe how the law will be implemented. I mean, that surely has to be one.
It's like a Big Four accounting firm writing the Tax Act, right?
Absolutely right. I think that is one thing where I think, it doesn't matter how hot the debate gets. That is one thing that I think everyone can sort of see now isn't great. It isn't great that we have tech industry and their representatives, in the States calling for Australia to be, wedged and for governments to lean on Australia against regulation. And then when they get over here, we give them the pen and let them write the code around it. Like, it just doesn't make sense.
Cam?
And I was just going to say that, I've kind of said the whole time that I actually don't think that the teen social media ban is actually that tough on big tech. Like, I'm not sure that they're earning an incredible amount of money from 13 to 16-year-olds. And I also think that, regulation tends to benefit the people who are already big, and social media companies are mostly worried about new apps coming out that are hitting the youngest users. So that's if you can kind of like regulate out 13 to 16-year-olds from creating accounts, maybe that's actually ends up being a good thing for the incumbents. What's really tough on tech is like coming up with nuanced policy that might set expectations for how we want them to treat our children in Australia. It isn't just like banning them all, but saying these are the features they should use and not use. This is what they need to be more careful about. Maybe here's, I'm going to say, and some more words that I'm sure Reese will love, but like, a duty of care for these platforms to have for their young users. Like that's actually how you are part on big tech, and not just kind of, randomly just deciding that some of the users in Australia can't use it anymore. So, I mean, the thing that I think about all the time is, it's no secret that all these other tech companies that are under the that are going to be affected by the ban have kind of been assisting journalists with their campaign, specifically about YouTube's exception and kind of being against it. But I think like we shouldn't just kind of fall into the trap of thinking that this debate is caught between social media ban or no social media ban. I actually think why I'm disappointed about pursuing this ban is that I think it's we've missed an opportunity for a better discussion, and we've literally wasted time kind of pursuing this ban. And yes, like the children's privacy code that's kind of happening, I think is a great example of exactly what we could be missing out on, the rules that could be applying to these social media companies, and maybe go beyond just privacy facts. But we're not having that discussion because we've just decided to kick them all off.
Yeah. Great. Look, that's a great way to finish the discussion, guys. Thanks so much for both of our new regulars, Reese and Cam. We'll be really keen to have you back for future discussions. We'll put a link also in the notes to Cam's website, the Sizzle. Encourage people to subscribe. There's not much great tech writing in Australia, but Cam is doing his best to turn that around. Thanks for being part of it. As always, Lizzie, good luck over the next few days before election time, and then we'll regroup afterwards. And again, thanks, Reese, for all your work and for joining us today. You've been listening to Burning Platforms. It was recorded on April 28 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.